Go
I
ahead.
watched you, linking your thinking thingy.
With Nick, yeah.
I can't believe the amount of libel mentioned against poor young Chris. Basically,
Well, that was kind of funny that Nick was like, "Oh yeah, why didn't I invite Chris?" Damn, he was on a list somewhere and I forgot. Yeah, that was kind of funny. Chris, you're a celebrity, but you already knew that.
and with
A very tiny circle.
since last week, and pointed out a couple of the old Obsidian bits, there's a Curtis McHale recent video of doing massage of the notes again. So he's doing the saga again of analog versus digital.
Right.
But whichever one you do, you need to engage with the notes, etc., etc. And then, of course, Morgan over in Toronto did, although she's a digital person, she redid this week. She did like a one-off on a paper card index example, just to prove it could be done.
Who was that, Nicole?
Morgan over in Toronto.
Oh, okay, yeah. No.
So, and she's done quite a nice little. I think in part she did one recently where she actually messed up the Zettelkasten numbering system in what she said, but not what she was writing on the cards. Oh. So she did like a retro edit to the screen, not to the sound. And I think that sparked an interest in her community. So she's redone it and walked it through the whole process, and then did an outgoing project on using the cards to write a piece of content. And it actually, I think she did, given she's a digital-based person, she did it really well. Cool. But partly because she's as I said before, she's on the circus and theatre and juggling side of the humanities. And she actually likes nice looking bullet journals type stuff.
Yeah.
Her cards, you can't be colorblind because she uses color coding to indicate what the text is. Is this a link to a note? Is this a link to a document? Is this a quote? And is this, below this line, is my other notes, other thoughts, literary card type thing. And that was, I thought was quite funny because that's where Curtis McHale started the other day, was he can't believe that particularly those people coming from the bullet journals side of the world make notes so pretty and they have time to use them, as opposed to what it is. This is my art. This is how I calm down, whatever, and that's it. I'm not going to use the notes for anything, etc. I just want to draw a often black and white version of a medieval or illuminated manuscript. Right. With or without marginalia, so Chris could get involved.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I got to turn on I do have to turn on the chat here, don't I? So I can see what's going on. So yes, and that's
quite an interesting chat. That was quite an interesting pairing of Jewish stuff from sort of semi-regular people that I didn't to.
Right. Well, that reminds me of people I used to follow. Kind of when I started pursuing this stuff, watching YouTube videos and stuff. It wasn't Ollie. It was another guy who had been a med student and had been using Notability, and actually had been sort of comparing iPad based writing and drawing apps to make these really, really elaborate notes for his anatomy classes, and and things like that, which I think he was sort of turning into sort of worksheets for for other students, or for people coming after him, and and probably also for undergraduates and people at a slightly less
Sorry, who was that?
level. It'll come to me. It wasn't Ollie. It was another. It was another med student that I followed. Maybe I'll see if I can find him. And that struck me. That kind of struck me as being interesting, but sort of also not what I really wanted to do. It was like, this is too much. It's beautiful, but that's not the finished product. I mean, it was a finished product, right? And it wasn't really kind of the finished product that I was going for. Let me see.
I think where the unwritten context that a lot of those people are adding or using, and they never talk about it, and it's never explicit. But when they're doing it, the heavy drawing and outlining and making it pretty, essentially they're creating a physical memory power that they're then able to kind of look at the page and know where the item is on the page to help them remember it. So when you're in a test or you need to remember the thing, you remember what the page looks like and the color and where things are in relation to other things. And that is the piece that helps you in that vein of note taking. But most people don't know that that's a thing. They, so they can't say it and make it explicit. So it just looks like, oh, I'm making pretty notes. Not, I'm putting this thing in this place, and the visuals on that page are helping me remember it. And it does a huge disservice to the space. Now that's similar to, although different from, I think, what I call the productivity porn, where you see the super pretty bullet journals, and they literally waste 5 times more time and effort making the pretty on the bullet journal than they're ever going to get out of it. And that, the only thing I can attribute that to is kind of what Tim said, that Zen practice of, here's how I'm going to calm down and clear my head for the week. And this is my mini art project, and this is just the form it takes.
Yeah.
But there again, no one talks about that on any of those channels. Mm-hmm. And I don't even think I've seen a video where someone takes that leveled charge of, you're wasting your time trying to save your time, and says, this is why I'm doing it. Mm-hmm. And ostensibly, otherwise, you look at it and they're only could be doing it for the likes and the clicks, or the, I want to share my process. Mm-hmm. But there are an awful lot of people out there who really feel the need to share their process on this thing that, I was surprised but not surprised to find that. And I don't know if you guys saw the thing that was a couple months back. I had a short post of some of the history of the mem index and I dated it finally, and I found it, the first few instances were in 1906, but the company itself started in 1903 and presumably was an extant thing before that. But literally a guy had, I think I still even have some samples because I cut some out. Yeah, I think this was, oh no, here's the original mem index size compared to a 4x6. So he was using a 2¼ by 4. I think was one of the originals, and then he went to ultimately, I think, maybe a 3½ by 2. Oh no, it's almost the size of a business card, is 3½ by 2. But he had a little wooden box, and all the cards had tabs on the top, which must have been a stationer's like dream. So each index card had the year, the date, the day printed on the tab, and it went through the whole year in one single box. And essentially, it was a tickler file. And the idea was you would take, a week or two's worth of cards and put them in like a business card case, put it in your vest pocket. And when somebody says, "Oh, you need to do this next Tuesday," you go down to Tuesday and you write that thing down. And it was literally a bullet journal on index cards.
Wow.
And you would keep the thing on your desk and the other pieces in your vest pocket. And, it was your tickler file.
Sounds very Dave Allen.
And it's, it's almost exactly the method that they prescribed was getting things done.
Yeah.
It was Dave Allen, but instead of 43 folders, it literally was 365 for the whole coming year.
Yeah.
But there was all of this productivity crap that everybody's selling some system of now. They were literally selling it as a physical product. And you could, in 1906, you could already buy it in like 3 different kinds of wood with, I think I made a joke about rich Corinthian leather. But, it was like, buy it in oak, you could buy it in, mahogany. It came with a couple different trim lines. I mean, they really were killing it and making it up into the mid 50s at least. And what kills me is, so here's this thing that hundreds of thousands of people had to have had on their desk, and it was advertised in the advertisement I found it in was there was because we all love Zettelkasten, one of the earliest manufacturers of card index cabinets was a company called Shaw Walker.
Yep. I remember seeing that.
I think in Michigan. And as a company, they started a business journal, magazine, to advertise and sell their stuff, but they were also selling business advice, essentially, or articles that had business advice for the burgeoning new business sector in America. And one of the guys who started it was a preeminent businessman of his day and served in government off and on. But he created this magazine called System that he sold in like 27, 28, if I recall. It ultimately became renamed Business Week and is now what we know as Bloomberg Business Week. So it morphed and changed throughout time and is still an ongoing business magazine concern for business related news in the United States. But all these traditions go stupidly far back into the early 1900s. I'm super curious to see what I may find in the late 1800s, because they surely went back, even further. That's trying to trace the history is a lot harder. But
well, I wonder if it kind of came about around the same time as kind of Taylorism and the sort of the whole scientific management craze, time slice sort of thing, because what it reminds me of is that what I just put in the chat, my sort of trajectory in my entry into business, where I was a salesman, right? So I was keeping track of my own time and all of that, from the Daytimer, which was this really sort of elaborate wallet thing that you stuck this little notebook into, one for each month, and then to the Franklin Planner, and then ultimately, then Stephen Covey sort of acquired the the I think Franklin, or they merged in some way, and then and then it had not only sort of the organizational stuff, but it had sort of that overlay of the 7 habits, and this is how and almost like a that was even more than GTD, right? That was like a philosophy of life or something. It was like or
That's what
reported to me.
the interesting thing is to watch who's selling these things and what they're actually selling.
Yeah.
So in the Mem Index case, they're literally physically selling you a box. And even in the early 1900s, like the wooden box and the stuff was, you know, couple bucks. It was not super expensive,
Yeah.
even for the time comparatively.
Well, and
But
the
they were
companies.
selling you a physical.
Go ahead.
The booklet and the description of how to use it was kind of a secondary piece, but they were selling you a physical stationary product versus now, where Franklin Covey is kind of they're selling you the paper, where Daytimer is still selling the paper and the thing as well as a little bit of the system.
Yeah.
But then Franklin Covey's big product, they're probably making way more money selling, 7 Effective Habits, or David Allen is, he's selling a book. And I think ultimately he himself got out of it, because it's, how do you really make money doing seminars, or if you're Nick Milo and you're charging for courses to sell this thing, it's a super time and touch intensive process. And it's not, and some people may need the structure of here's the example of how you do it.
Yeah.
And watching people online asking questions in forum like, hey, I'm starting a Zettelkasten and I have this question, and it's kind of like, read a book or a half a book and then just start doing it. And the rest will fall out. You'll either figure out what works for you along the way. Nobody is going to come up with, I mean, to me, the only big, and it's quite, to me, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, whether the innovation is actually an innovation. But I have yet to be able to pin down exactly where Lumen, he inherit his system from someone. Did someone suggest it to him? We have the bit of information that he read Haida's book, and so he knew a thing existed. Most of his system was extant to that time. But did he have a professor or a college chum who said, hey, no, do it, try it this way? And so he did.
Yeah.
I have a long thesis that I'm eventually going to publish of how I think he did it. But essentially, he is taking Melville Dewey's idea of indexing ideas and putting them on the shelf next to each other. So when you go to the math section, you're going to find all the math ideas on the same shelf.
Right.
And he's doing that, but with individual ideas. Here's my shelf where sociology lives, or this subsection of sociology. And within a few cards of it, all my ideas within that space are going to be there. Yeah. So it's not a huge innovation what he's done, because Melville Dewey has done it in the late 1800s. He's just done it with books and bigger chunks of ideas. And very few people are going to have a practice that's so dense that beneficial thing for them.
I just lost the picture, but your sound improved.
Oh, I did. Oh, I think something disconnected and it probably switched. It killed my camera and switched to microphone.
Yeah.
That's super weird.
Yeah.
But if it's not better, I'll stick with whatever microphone is working at the moment.
Yeah, it was glitching a little bit beforehand, so it's been going on for the last 5
minutes. Yeah, I saw the camera was doing weird stuff, but we'll see if we can get it back in a few minutes. But that is one of the few innovations that anyone has seen in the space. But otherwise, we've been doing more or less the same damn thing, and everybody's so surprised or wants to call it a name, like
it really pains my heart when somebody says it's the, you know, the Ryan Holiday card system,
Right.
or at least if they're a little more honest, they're like it's the Robert Greene, card system, and I'm like, it's,
Yeah,
stuff's
and
been
it's kind of
around.
funny because I had a moment like that when I was talking to Nick. Somebody in the chat or the QA said, "Well, have you, what are you going to talk about, source notes and point notes?" And I said, "No, I'm not." Because I don't think we need another way of describing these things. It works for me, but people should. Yeah, I think it's too. I mean, it's kind of funny because there in the past, I guess there were slower. Oh, I can see you now. There were slower product life cycles or whatever, and these things were sort of productized so that you had Daytimer, and then you had Franklin, and you had these you had Stephen Covey's 7 Habits and the 1 Minute Manager, and everybody had their own thing and kind of went took it to the bank. And now the life cycle of this is so much more rapid because it's all happening on people's YouTube channels or whatnot. I yeah. And then there's something that Pat put up in the vault. Did you see it about Scott? But while we're before we talk about that, Tim, what do you want to throw in?
I was just semi picking up on meaning of notes rather than permanent literature or something. Partly because of chapter 4, because you know me, I always want to come back to the book.
You're always dragging us off into Obsidian.
I started off, I didn't intend for you to all follow and stay there. You weren't invited. I was quite impressed with the way she jumped from the linearity of Newtonian mechanics to coming back to saying, putting the gardening gloves on and getting involved in non-linear, chaotic operations. I think that was quite good, especially seeing one of my favourite is Maggie, what's her name? Who's very much into the gardening metaphor for the notes. And I quite like that, but I also thought that Kate, in her slightly dismissive talk of how the economists are still being taught linearity and these pre-World War II type mathematician economists. And it sort of came back to me about when you do physics, we learn about the Newtonian stroke Galilean very mechanical clockwork model first, and then we evolve to a probabilistic, Einsteinian, almost quantum mechanics piece, and then we end up with now thoughts on things like networking and dynamics of all elements. And you end up with things like, at a simple level, you're going to end up with something like, I forgot what the name of the technique is then.
I thought it was interesting. It struck me, I guess I wasn't as, fully convinced that. I mean, I kind of got the argument that she was making about this sort of progress of metaphors, and to whatever extent, I guess that, that there's a bigger argument that that these are kind of scientific metaphors that that sort of become part of the zeitgeist and direct our thinking in other fields. Then yeah, I get that. I get the part where Jevons kind of comes up with this mechanical sort of mechanistic equilibrium, laws of equilibrium of the lever, kind of ways of describing what he's seeing in economics, around page 113. And then, and then on the next page, we get the famous Alfred Marshall supply demand, which is even, becomes even a bigger part of Samuelson. But as I was reading this, one of the things I was wondering about was, are these things really the best ways to describe what people are seeing, or are people finding things to talk about that conform to these models, and often sort of finding these things for for self-interested reasons, right? Because they get they get you to the conclusion that you want to come to.
Yeah, I thought that in part. My criticism of it along the lines, until you've got the level of Newtonian mechanics under your belt, dare not take a step out and then think about Einsteinian physics thereof. In the same way as when you learn things, you do Pythagoras in 2D, you don't then leap off into, it's a bit like that meme about mathematic questions. It's like the classwork is 1 + 1 = 2 and always equals 2. And the homework is a bit of multiplication, stroke long division. And the exam question is a complete economics paper. And there's no lesson in between. And it's the thing that I thought where it broke down as a truly luxury metaphor was its scale of things. If you and I are negotiating about me buying X number of copies of my book, we don't care what the rest of the world's doing. I could bring the rest of the world price in for a 80-page paperback in its third revision, but it's not necessary. It's me talking to you about only 1,000 copies, and it's materially going to be a one-off. It's a one-shot cannonball out of a Newtonian cannon shot into known weather. Weather is not going to be that significant. So, we don't need the World War II ballistic calculators that are becoming mechanical to give me a better shot. So we're not talking about John Nash and his game theory on negotiations about nuclear deterrence, etc. They're all the next step up. And there seems to be no acceptance of there is a natural progression of complexity, stroke sophistication in what we're doing. I mean, under normal circumstances, for me inside my buildings, probably the single most complicated thing is what's the CO2 level inside and how should I vary the ventilation rate to mean that I don't make people fall asleep. And the biggest question in normal conditions is, so how often is the door going to open?
Right.
And if so, which way is the wind blowing?
Right.
It's nothing to do with the actual system being provided or the normal calculation, which is a second level derivative. It's not just a simple piece of derivative.
Right.
because we produce carbon dioxide, we bring it in from outside, it goes out in the direction. And if it's daylight and I've got any plants in the building, I've got a negative consumption of CO2, not just production.
Mm-hmm.
It's all in the equation. It's not that difficult. It's only like 15 terms. So,
yeah,
it comes back to what we can actually measure simply and in the normal day-to-day work of doing so. And we never actually measure the CO2 directly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I thought her quite quick. It's only like the first half of chapter 3. And it follows on from chapter 3 to 6. Chapter 4, first half, is all very quick rush, isn't it? From like 1800s into the late 70s. And the what I was hoping I would actually be able to get to try and work back is David Collender in 2000 did his science fiction piece for 2050, where he thought economists finally caught up with the maths in 2020 or 2030. I thought that sounded interesting. I might go and look at that. I just haven't got around to it. So it's on the list to do. But it's and rather like Chris was saying about people with their products and their productivity pool and I need to make this a system I can sell, so I need to put my own words on it, etc. And not necessarily explain where the history of the developments come from, such that all those other people get credit. And it's literally this. Before, but there's Melvin Bragg is a arts type person, but mostly TV and radio. Does a couple of books, and he reminds us in one of his books about even Newton stood on the shoulders of giants to come up with what he did.
Yeah,
because the science stuff literally goes through that scientific method type evolution. This is what we know, add one more step. Because most instances, people don't add up more than 3 or 4 steps in a leap. Even in things like, we now know what the DNA shape is. That allows us to understand why it does what it does much better than we did before. We had proper crystallography pictures, which were took a certain skill to do and a certain skill to read, and now they've done that work. We all know what a double helix looks like. We don't need to go back to the crystallographer stuff anymore.
But we also have
there's no panic before I think not at the levels we're talking about.
But we also have the entire world economy hanging every month on what the Fed's going to do with interest rates up or down. Literally, they're changing one measure because they only have one lever in one of the most complex economic systems on the planet. And that I listen fairly regularly to Marketplace on NPR, and they have like their little 10-minute segments at the end of morning news at the bottom of the hour, and then they have a half an hour show every day. I think it's Kai Rizdal usually is the host, and he talks about the economy, and they spend a ridiculously inordinate amount of time talking about not just the Fed, but the interest rate number. Is it going up? Is it going down? And what are the ripple effects of that? But it's kind of like, they're sitting there reading tea leaves, and they don't give context of what this is. They never say, hey, this is the only lever the Fed has, and we have a million other levers that the president can play with. What's worse is Congress could play with a lot of these levers and choose not to, or don't have the technical sophistication, or if they did have the technical sophistication, they don't have any kind of consensus or generic, this is what we're going to do and why. They kind of say, hey, it's the status quo, and let's all blame the Fed because they're the super genius PhDs in economics. But the only thing they can do is say up or down or stay the same.
Right.
They have three choices, the group of them. And somehow we think that is going to fix the world.
Yeah.
Separately. Oh, go ahead, Dan.
It's interesting. My partner, when I was teaching that last semester, I was teaching that economic history course, was just, he said again and again, and he kept coming back to it, how great a thing, how fortuitous a thing it was that in 2007, 2008, the guy who was in charge was Ben Bernanke, who had written his dissertation on the Great Depression, right? So he was the one guy who knew what to do. Yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, given what Chris has just said, why one that I was going to jump in is, so you really want the GOP to then not redo the debt ceiling, close the government down for 6 weeks? That's one of the levers, right?
Well, it's a potential lever, but it's the stupidest lever on the planet from their perspective. But for a party who only respects power and the wielding of power, that's what they're going to do. The Democrats for the last, umpteen years, and even worse, the Republicans are hypocritical because when they were recently in power and had all the things, they had the Supreme Court, they had the Senate, they had the House, they had the presidency, and accomplished nothing. And they could have cut the deficit. They did cut taxes, but they did nothing to the deficit or fix anything.
Right.
And they just did the same thing they always do when they have all three of the big pieces, and they didn't fix it. So they're only crying wolf now because it suits their political purposes.
Yeah, I mean, even if we just take the books with covers, the U.S. poverty one, or was it Piketty, showed that the bulk of the population is better off with a Democrat in the House, and Democrats in the control of both institutions as well. And yet, the supposed small person farmer, who is most in need of that socialist purview, is the least likely to vote for. So it's city dwellers that want the hand, and yet farms need it, or farmers need it, to fight against the big corporations trying to sell them Roundup and GMO seeds at an extortionate price, and you can't save them, etc., etc., etc. So I find it odd.
Yeah, but there are so few working farmers in America nowadays. I think, yeah, I agree with all of that. I think to kind of jump back to kind of what Rayworth is doing in this chapter, right? Yeah, I agree with what you said earlier, Tim, that that she assumes that there's a linear scaling effect, right? And that there is some way to sort of aggregate individuals, going back to that well, not the eggs and the chickens diagram, but the supply and demand curve, right? That these things are sort of market measures that aggregate all these decisions theoretically, right, that consumers are making and that producers are making, and there's generally way more consumers than there are producers, but there are usually multiple producers as well. So so the idea is that you can aggregate those things, right, and you can and that it's static, right, and that's the big, I think for me, that's one of the big problems that economics had throughout the 20th century, because it goes from Marshall at 1890 to Samuelson in 1948, and it's still static, right? You're still, I mean, because everybody is making, and this, she does mention that that there's a bunch of, when she gets to the part complexity in economics, right, on 121, she says that Marshall argued against these, kind of mechanical metaphors. Hayek argued against these, this propensity to imitate as closely as possible the success of the physical sciences, and then Daly, talked about externalities. But I think the other thing that is missing there is the static nature of it, because every one of these decisions, these decisions to consume or not, right, to buy at a price that's changing or not, is happening at the margin. And so, and there's never any sort of reconciliation of all these individuals making these marginal decisions, and some type of a static model that is linear at scale, and that creates some type of aggregate demand. I mean, to go a step beyond what she's quoting Friedrich Hayek as saying here, the Austrians, especially Ludwig von Mises, were very adamant about the fact that you couldn't aggregate, right, and that there was no such thing as a legitimate field of macroeconomics, because you couldn't actually come up with any legitimate numbers that had any type of validity.
Or even do the models, at what level are they working and how useful is it? So right now in the US economy, at least, in the early pandemic, people still had money and they had jobs, and they were buying larger home appliances to improve their homes because that's where they were spending all their time. Mm-hmm. So there was a huge spike in people buying washers and dryers, new ovens, new dishwashers, blenders. And we got a blender recently, and I'm pretty sure we bought a blender at the dead bottom of the market because everybody bought that stuff in the early pandemic. There were supply chain issues that didn't let them rebuild and restock, but now they have since restocked, and everything is, that demand curve, if you want to believe it, is now at the peak again. So there are a million blenders out there, and there's too many.
Yeah.
So you can go to Target, and Target is having sales of up to $100 off blenders as a result. But knowing the economy to that level is a stupidly hard thing to do. And it's not, nobody on the news is going to say, hey, blenders are on a crazy sale right now if you should need one. But the problem is most people don't need a new one because they bought one 2 years ago. So those kind of cycles in the news, there's not enough. We all think there's even information, but as a consumer, I would love to know. Okay, let's say, so I'm about to buy maybe a Books e-ink tablet. For reading and note taking, so I can do some research and figure out kind of what's out there and available now, but I have no idea what those supply chains look like or what the internal company numbers look like to know, are all of these the 7 or 8 companies that are making these, are they going to exist 5 years from now? Are they still going to be supporting them? Are they going to do updates for them? I would love that kind of information so that I could better choose. The only information I can do is, okay, who's been making these for a while, and are they likely to keep making them? And the best I can do is guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the level of complexity I can get to is almost nil.
Mhm. Well, and a lot of times that is deliberately kind of sort of kept invisible, right? I think I was listening to I didn't listen to the Tesla annual meeting Q&A, but I did listen to a CNBC interview with Elon Musk afterwards, and he was asked about the Tesla, because the cars have been, the price is up, the price is down, the price is up, it's gone up, they've changed it again, and he's been getting a lot of people have been making fun of Tesla for that. And what he said was interesting. I thought he said, "Yeah, that happens in the auto industry all the time. The major manufacturers don't change the list price of their cars, but they have rebate deals. They have negotiation at the dealership level. They have all of this. That the price of a car is moving constantly." But people don't know that. People don't realize that because it's not, something that somebody has put up on their website and said, okay, the price, the price that you'll pay today is this, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot. I think there's a lot.
Generally, unless there's big supply chain issues, the sort we've seen over the last 2 years that make demand and supply or change supply dramatically. At the beginning of a model year of a car is usually in August is the new. So the 2024s roughly will come out in late July, early August.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the most expensive those cars are going to be because they're brand new.
Right.
And the longer they stay out, the lower the price gets until the 2025s will show up. So, and it's other than maybe the fiscal year or the calendar year changing in December, because there are tax implications to buying $100,000 car for the average consumer, or even a $50,000 car, there are tax benefits to the dealership to get rid of those cars before the calendar year. Because if you carry it into the next year, there are tax implications to the dealer. So they may discount things just a little bit more at the tail end of the year, and there's a difference there. But you'll notice it's offset almost 6 months from the beginning of the car year. So you're halfway through the model year.
Right. And then also
some of that out.
Then also the interest rate that they allow on different terms of car financing is another way of affecting, kind of the reality of the price in terms of the monthly payment.
But there's this fake thing when you listen to car commercials, like, and I heard one yesterday driving home and literally had this thought, hey, there's a sale on this car at Toyota only to the end of the month. And what you don't know is at the end of the month, there's going to be another sale for the end of next month.
Right.
Because the value of those cars sitting on the lot is going down constantly.
Mm-hmm.
Because the new model year, here we're in May, the new model year is a couple months away. They're trying to clear out the inventory.
Right. Well, and this, I just got a Subaru. I got one of the last 2023 Crosstreks that was available in March, and I got one off the floor. But there were only a dozen on the way in, and to this particular, it's a small dealership, but they were already transitioning to the 24, right? And so like within a month of when I bought that 2023 in like the beginning of April, you couldn't even order, and that actually, I mean, they don't have a lot of inventory, right? They're selling them as fast as they make them. But there's that. And then of course there's also, the when interest rates change, then the cost of carrying that inventory on a dealer's lot increases, right? So then there's even more incentive, at a higher interest rate to get it off the lot. I think there's all this stuff that's happening, kind of even under the radar behind the scenes.
The average consumer who buys a car doesn't realize typically they're in the dealerships make it super unnoticeable to you, but usually you're going in and you're doing 3 completely separate transactions. and they're using the fact that they have roughly 3 buckets to play with to maximize their profit in all 3 buckets. So usually you go in, you're selling a prior car that you may be trading in. So you're negotiating that, and that's transaction number one. You're negotiating the price of your new car is transaction number two. And then you have transaction number three is the cost of your financing, which they're trying to give you as well if they can. So when you walk in the door, they're trying to get 3 pieces of business from you, and they can give you less on your trade-in, or they may say later in the thing, if they've got space to play around with, we can only give you this percentage rate, but we'll give you a little more on your trade-in maybe to make you feel better. But really they're screwing you on one of the other deals to make up for it. Or all of the above, or they're trying to screw you on all 3 of those deals, but they're trying to package it in a way because they're, from your perspective, how much do I put down today and how much am I paying per month are the 2 things you're more likely to care about.
Right.
So they're designing their deal to those 2 numbers, but in doing that, it's pretty hard to get more than a 5-year financing right now. But if they could go 6 or 7 so that your monthly number is lower, they're making a huge amount on the interest to give you a 6 or 7-year finance deal. So they'd do it if they could.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting that, the things that are sort of talked about and the things that are not. And if I can jump back to the text with an example of that, which I thought was relevant. And so I sort of lost a little bit of confidence in Kate Rayworth for not mentioning it. She, in this boom on 123, in this bubble boom and bust thing that she's talking about here.
Newton.
She missed an opportunity, with Isaac Newton and the South Sea bubble in between 1720 and 1725. What she doesn't mention is this was not a monopoly on trading with South American colonies. This was the Asiento. This was the British monopoly on the slave trade that was run by the South Sea Company. And so that's what Sir Isaac Newton was investing in. And I think that not only do I sort of object to her not mentioning that on, a kind of general history and moral basis, but also I think it's relevant, isn't it?
Yeah, it seems to be, but there's another case too where she talks about the invention of the game Monopoly, and there are a few useful and relevant details because I've looked into the history of that, and there's a really great documentary. I think PBS American Experience has it, and it's still probably streamable online. But it was like an hour and a half documentary of the invention and the sale, and a game inventor sued Parker Brothers, or countersued Parker Brothers for infringing. He made a game called Anti-Monopoly in the 70s, and he did a 20-year lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court, and spoiler alert, he won. But he did it because he went back and found this woman who created the original Monopoly game. And it was actually 2 games. There were 2 sets of rules. One that's the game we play now, and then another that was a little more socialist she was doing it to advertise a land tax that she thought was a good idea. And the history of it is phenomenally awesome and rich. Even my 12-year-old thought this documentary, she was like, wow, that was really great. But we learned a lot about the U.S. legal system and about economics by watching it, which she didn't know, because for her it was more about the fun of the history of this documentary about Monopoly. But she leaves some salient points out about that history that I think would have been better nuanced, but I'm not sure. They don't dramatically change the meaning of her point in writing about it here. So I will let it slide, because there's only so much she can do in the span of the 2 or 3 pages she dedicates to it. So I don't, in those cases, yes, there's a lot there are big chunks of things she's leaving out to weave the bigger story. Yes, you can get in deeper into the weeds. And the case you mentioned, I think it's probably a little more salient to that particular argument. But it's also, her point is that here's Newton, the guy who invented the system and who actually did a lot of early economics. I think he ran the mint essentially for the country, as I recall, and did a lot of work in counterfeiting.
Yes, he did.
And nobody talks about that. It's all about the calculus and the science and the physics,
right?
Not his influence in other areas.
Yeah, well, and that's I think that is all. Yeah, and I guess this was about the time I started getting a little bit frustrated with her, and my frustration grew actually in chapter 5, I think, that she was spending a little bit too much time name dropping economists, and this is sort of a historiography of economics, to more of an extent than I think care. And doesn't mention some of these other things. I think that I think that where she wants to go is to kind of this, Nick Hanauer, Eric Liu, garden metaphor, right? And Nick Hanauer, of course, is famous as, for being the billionaire who, is most critical of the billionaire class, at least he was at one time. I think he's sort of receded from the spotlight a little bit, right? But he did a TED talk about plutocracy and stuff, and then I think he still has a podcast, but I don't know that it's as popular as it once was.
One of the interesting things, though, I thought with naming the various economists, her whole it is the economists in the end don't do anything except influence decision makers, right? For the most part. They can try to inform, but they're often in positions of offering models of how things are going or why things work the way they work. And then, if you take a kind of cynical perspective, it's like, okay, I can find somebody out there who says something that allows me to justify what I want to justify. So, there's this whole section about the Kuznets curve or whatever it's called. Is that the right pronunciation?
Yeah.
And okay, so that is, it's going to be unpleasant and there's going to be people hurt by this, but in the long run, of course, it will work out. And, she makes mention of, okay, this was a Nobel winner now as a consequence, lending some gravitas to that position. It read a lot to me like trickle-down economics, It'll all get to you eventually, which of course wasn't true. That's the whole point. She starts from the book, economists need to wake up and they need to take into account other variables in their models and all this kind of stuff. But then there's a lot of pressure to be simplistic and communicative. And in doing so, they offer different models that someone takes up and uses as a justification, the real decision makers, for actions that are taken.
Mm-hmm.
And even I was thinking about, okay, so this guy or Kuznets comes up with this theory that's accepted and acted upon as justification for certain kinds of decision making to allow the expansion of inequity, because in the long run, the rich folks are going to somehow pull us out of whatever. And somebody decided that that's worth a Nobel. And it's one of those things. It's almost like, well, okay, what are the justifications for giving credit or importance to different perspectives? It's not like, to me, it's not like science that advances, biology advances, chemistry advances. Economics, and that's maybe what you're talking about, it's very complex. It kind of just drifts around back and forth. And it's really about who can gain traction for their perspective. And then as a little guy, let's say, in the whole scheme of things, what's going to be imposed on me by whom, and is it legitimate? I don't know. It's like, I mean, to me, there's starting to be some things here I see across domains, and even in the AI, it's like, who trains the model, right? Mm-hmm. And what are their values? Before we get all excited about, this or that, there's the more basic question about what values influenced this model, what values influenced this AI approach. It's a model too. Mm-hmm. Is it just the white rich guys, or are women involved, or so anyway, that's just a thought on this.
I agree. And I think that Kuznets, the other thing that, in addition to the curve, the other thing that he's known for is he's the guy who sort of put GDP on the map, right? That before the, and this would have been in the 30s, right? At the beginning of the Great Depression, right? He actually started looking at U.S. Sort of national income accounts, and creating, it was GNP first, and now it's GDP more often, and so that is, that was kind of his initial kind of contribution. Yeah, it's interesting that he's, that the curve, I mean, and that's why actually I think Rayworth's biggest contribution is the idea that, the pencil is the thing that's going to change the world, right? Because that is, it's these little graphs. It's this supply and demand, intersection. It's the Kuznets curve. It's the Laffer curve. It's all these very simple things that you can, that you could draw on a note card or a cocktail napkin. And they seem to be so sticky. They seem to be memes. And so that's, that's really, that's interesting to me. Which again,
are they really, or are they just ideas thrown out there that people in positions of influence seize upon this one instead of that one? Because it's always, there has to be a certain logic justifying these things, but it's, what I'm saying? It's not like, it isn't really a science.
Right. I agree with you.
It isn't really something that moves progressively forward.
Right.
And so,
but it does it's like a theory. Cartoon. It does capture people's imagination, though, right? People do believe that there is there's a supply curve and there's a demand curve, and and there's a place where they meet, and that is meaningful. And they don't necessarily understand what that means, because it doesn't really mean anything, right? But they believe that it's a thing, and I think that's where and there was and I think last week I sort of harped on this other book that I'm reading about the Hunter Gatherer's Guide by Heather Hying and Brett Weidenstein. And I think what one of the things that they mention is that they think of memes as not being, they actually talk about the whole progression, in the Selfish Gene, where Richard Dawkins first starts talking about memetics, that they say that he makes the mistake of separating it, because really memetics is connected to the same sort of evolutionary process, and actually serves that evolutionary process. And I thought that was kind of an interesting way of thinking about this, that these things are not. I think that they're kind of very substantial. They're very meaningful. Yeah, and then the other thing, the other one, the other crazy, meme shaped thing is Pareto, right? The 80-20 rule. Go ahead, Chris. Sorry about that.
No, I'm just going to say one of the things that, and it's the hidden pieces of the economy that we don't talk about and we don't center because it's not, it doesn't serve the kind of big capitalistic machine, is when the economy turns down, we make shifts in public policy, and especially in things like the pandemic or the downturn in 2008. The first huge swath of people to lose their jobs, and it's in part because they're not measured, their value isn't, they're valued economically, but they're not valued kind of morally or from a moral perspective. But it's women and people of color are the first ones to lose their job. And during the pandemic, a lot of women, and it really kills me to have heard stories of, a woman who has 3 kids and a husband who's unemployed shuts down her company that's keeping 10 families working because her husband won't pick up and take care of the kids and deal with homeschooling. And the only way for her to do it is, we've got enough money and I feel comfortable enough for a family decision. I'm going to shut my company down, quit running it, and unemploy 20 or 30 people so that I can go home and take care of the kids so that my immediate family is fine. Yeah. But we don't do a good enough job measuring those things and those effects. But that her choice to kind of save her family and keep her family afloat destroys 15 other families. Mm-hmm. And so when we do things like austerity, almost all of that squeeze gets put on women first, and families, people of color. Mm-hmm. And because they don't matter enough in the economy, because we don't measure them the way we measure GDP, and because they're not unionized, they don't represent a big enough voting bloc to hold politicians' feet to the fire. And on top of that, we don't have a way to we don't have a name for that effect. Maybe we should call it the Alasso effect so that it can be a thing now.
I think the
was a good idea, Dan.
More appropriate.
Yeah.
Well, I think
I agree.
talking about
things are never named
other books
for
you're reading. Talking about other books you're reading while you're reading this one, and I said last week I was reading Bernie Sanders' book. It's really an interesting combination because like you were just saying, Chris, about it's like who has leverage and how far do you think in terms of your influence. Of course, Bernie Sanders would say, well, if the unions were really functional, and then who is really and then if you could ignore that sector of society because they're on strike, fine, but they would have a much better chance of being recognized for their true contributions if you find out you can't do without them.
Well, I was thinking,
or in the pandemic, we found out, we have essential workers who we can't survive without. The grocery store stocker is the most important person in your life. You just don't realize it,
Right. Right.
and you take them for granted.
Yep. Yeah. It's almost like what Brad Pitt said in Fight Club. We are the people who watch you while you sleep. Don't fuck with us.
I was thinking the other way as well. But it's things like last week, last week sometime, there was the stage of Omaha doing his Berkshire annual meeting report. She does by Zoom these days. We don't even have to have a share to get it, albeit get it a day or so later on YouTube. And then you look at things like what Jason Harkle or even Rita elsewhere talks about Buffett and Charlie Munger, where it's something along the lines of they own 20% of the 5 biggest US airlines. And so they own more airline than any airline actually does, in essence. And so if they go and lobby for things to help airlines and reduce airline costs, reduce regulations, and because they don't own 51% of anything, they don't get tagged with being a no influencer type thing. Yet we, all of whom say own Berkshire shares, don't have the same influence over Charlie and Buffett and Warren, and they do over things they don't own, but they own a sector rather than the actual companies. Okay, they will also talk about where their money comes from, where they expect the profit to be in the next 5 years. They quite everybody is the bulk of their profit they're going to give to the shareholders is coming from the investments in insurance. And I was thinking, you're going to be paying out big time with things like climate change, floods, and wind and fire. So there's going to be a major change coming up. And of course, in the last 2 or 3 weeks, in Europe, for instance, there's been progress movement on the eco side coming out, such that they're now being able to look at companies saying, we want money back because you've damaged the environment. Now, nobody's actually won big time yet, but it looks as though there's a good number of cases coming up where the damage is activists have been killed. So instead of taking a criminal case, they're taking a civil route, as in it's a probability of happening. It's not an absolute evidence. And so you end up with past presidents being actual rapists. But because it's not a criminal court, it gets downgraded to sexual assault. As soon as we turn around and say, you killed X, you on probability killed or directly influenced the killing of half a dozen of these activists, or journalists even, then BP and Shell and Saudi Aramco and the rest of it are going to be paying it. They have money. That's why you sue them. The person who makes the mistake may not be somebody who has money. I've been back position in court a couple of times where the person we should be going after has no insurance because he was a plumber. So who has, for the building design, who has the insurance? The structural engineer, because he has to be a professional. So we go for his insurance because we've got carbon monoxide poisoning. Yeah. And if they're too big to fail, it's fine. We don't want to fail. We want their money.
Too big to fail means big enough to nationalize. Okay, so let's take that right back to the text, because that is a piece of, was that in chapter 5 or did I read ahead to chapter 6 accidentally? Where she starts talking about I think it's in the who makes your money section. I thought she became kind of incoherent. In this idea of central, imagine for starters, if central banks were to take back the power to create money and then issue it to commercial banks while simultaneously requiring them to hold 100% reserves for the loans they make, meaning that every loan would be backed by someone else's savings or the bank's own capital. 100% reserve requirement means that if a bank got $1 million in deposits, they would be able to make $1 million loan. That's not, I mean, that makes no economic sense at all. I do not get what she's saying.
Excuse me, do you have any idea how Islamic finance works?
No, I don't.
If I want a loan, because they can't profit from my paying interest, they are allowed to make a profit because they then have to take a backup investment in commodities to match my loan. So if I want 100,000 local dibdobs, whatever it happens to be, they have to spend another 100,000 on gold or orange futures or rice or something.
Oh, it's a good thing they have all that oil revenue.
And
that's where she starts talking about crypto, isn't it? Because as an alternative that would somehow address whatever model she has, and you have to buy participants in a cryptocurrency, right? As I understand it, have to buy crypto to put have to buy something to put something into the system, and then it just moves around. And so, as I understand what she's arguing with that's different what banks do, because in other words, you can't move around money that isn't within that system, right? And I think she's arguing that banks move around money that really isn't there. Is that not the distinction she's trying to make?
See, I didn't get, and it may have been the way this was written or edited. So I won't say that I think that Kate Rayworth doesn't understand money, but that was the impression I got, that that there isn't really that she really doesn't understand, sort of in the way that maybe David Graeber does in Debt, the first 5,000 years, kind of deal directly with what is money? Is it a medium of exchange? Is it a store of value? How does it get created? I think that she makes some interesting and important points. Especially, I love that postcard that Fay Lewis made about the vacant lot, right? I mean, that is, I think that is so relevant. And the idea, the quote from E.P. Thompson, that enclosure, when all the sophistications are allowed for, was a plain enough case of class robbery. So I do think that and earlier on in chapter 4, she does mention that Piketty in 2014, kind of made that transition from only talking about income inequality to actually talking about wealth inequality, and to talking about kind of this entrenched plutocracy that's based on on generationally inherited property, whether it's capital or real estate or whatever. I did look up Bill Gates. He is the 47th largest landholder in America with his 270,000 acres. And Ted Turner is number 4 with 2 million acres.
You got pushed. Usually it's Ted Turner and John C. Malone are the two who are fighting each other for. So who are the top 4 now?
I'll tell you. Hang on. Let me get back to it. Summer 23 notes. It is so the people right now. And I'll tell you. I stuck it in my.
Ted Turner owns so much of Montana, right? Isn't that what really drove up the? I mean, basically.
Yeah. Well, usually they own a lot of.
Typically,
they own a lot of wilderness land.
Yeah, and he calls it a trust. So John Malone is number 2 right now. Number 1 is this guy named Big Red Emerson, and he owns Sierra Pacific Industries, which has a holding of 2,320,000 acres. Malone's got 2,200,000, but they call it a land preservation company. And then the Reed family, and then Ted Turner. And Ted's got 2 million, and he calls it the Institute of Eco Agriculture.
Yeah, I've been for probably 20 years now. Been watching Ted Turner and John Malone back and forth, almost as a personal, like a game between the two of them. Who can own the most land? And generally they're doing it for preservation, but they're both media titans. Most people know at least who Ted Turner is.
Yeah.
John Malone was the number 2 guy at a company called TCI that was one of the first players in the cable industry.
Oh, okay.
And he is, and most people don't even know the name of his company now is Liberty Media. But for a while, he essentially owns a media portfolio. You could think of it like as a mutual fund, and essentially he owns 51% or more of almost every cable channel on the planet.
Nice.
And to the point that typically, and he's built it up as an empire in such a way that if he needed to, he could sell it off to buy one of the major studios, which was his goal for ages, and I don't think he's ever going to make it. But when, let's say, Universal Studios went up for sale, he was the number 2 bidder and almost got it, and then NBC ended up winning. But
he owns Sirius XM too.
So yeah, Sirius XM was his. Rupert Murdoch literally has built. There are so many poison pills built into Fox and Fox properties, specifically meant to keep Malone out. And it literally, Murdoch has shot himself in the foot and lost huge amounts of money to prevent Malone from buying his company out from underneath him. But for ages, Malone had like 5% of AOL Time Warner. He held 5 to almost 10% of News Corp. Multi-billionaire. And he buys and sells things on the open market, but because he's doing chunks of companies rather than some massive conglomerate, no one notices. But if you read Hollywood Reporter, Variety, his photo appears in those magazines more times every year than any other 10 movie stars combined.
Wow.
Yeah, but that section, you said you thought it was garbled or not well. Or I thought you'd like parts of it, like this is the 5 opportunities section you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
That you need to change who controls land, who creates money. I don't even know what enterprise is. I have it in my notes here. Technology, which you know, things like federated Mastodon. I don't know. I translate this into things I know, and then knowledge. So I listened to that interview that you did, and you were talking about, well, even today you mentioned that the idea that people can't really afford to be educated, and you know, the idea of sharing information via YouTube and whatever is a way to diversify the sharing and development of knowledge. So I don't know how people translate these. Seems to me what she's trying to do is say, well, here's the things where there are opportunities, and then what qualifies, you know, what qualifies within these is that would be open to people who you know, who are willing to invest their time and resources because of a value, you know, understanding the value here. Right. So that's why I mentioned crypto, because obviously, if we want, we can participate in the crypto market. We can do so. I mean, the thing that I think is wrong with a lot of this stuff is crypto ended up being more of a money-making, seems to be more of a money-making. It wasn't that you were just finding a way to share money outside of the traditional system. It was like you're going to make money because you put in $1,000 and it went up to 5,000, or
well, it was like that empty. Yeah, it was like that vacant lot. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, well, I view a lot of the crypto stuff more as a Ponzi scheme. Well, but without a Ponzi at the top. It's I can buy stuff, and most of it was driven by a tech bro culture on Twitter.
Yeah.
Hey, you know, let's do this. I invested my money. You should invest yours. But when you invest yours, that makes mine go up.
Sure.
And then I can sell mine out to the next sucker who comes in. Right. And then somebody, but it's a closed system, so somebody's going to be left holding the bag with a whole bunch of crypto.
So then what is the difference then, definitionally, between a Ponzi scheme and the network effect?
Well, yeah, I don't understand the argument that I know I agree with you that you sell the idea. I mean, to me, as a basic idea, there's nothing wrong with crypto. I understand what you're saying, that the proliferation of multiple cryptocurrencies has been promoted pretty much as a Ponzi scheme. And that's part of the problem, is that it's unregulated, right? I don't see anything wrong with an alternative way of exchanging money, or whatever we think of as money. But you're right. The tech bros got kind of a hold of it and played it as a Ponzi scheme.
Right, but the things that they were hoping it would do, right. would be a store, that it would be a store of value, and I think it remains. I think that she made a mistake, you know, talking about blockchain and talking about Ethereum, because I think that
because it's not an example, or because it's prone to.
Well, because I think she was trying to
give an example of what would fit there, right?
I think she should have talked about Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is explosive, right? Everybody has an opinion about Bitcoin. I think that she sort of, when she wrote this, I think she probably thought that Bitcoin was a more legit, you know, and kind of grown up version. I don't think that's
well. She also wrote this book. She probably also wrote this book in 2015, 2016.
That's right.
And it was released in 2017.
Yeah.
And we all know, I mean, I have held this general position on Bitcoin since, you know, year one or year two after it came out, and knew that without the regulation, it's going to turn into crazy. And you can't treat Bitcoin like a stock market, because you don't want, you know, there are people who arbitrage money in markets across the world, but it's a tiny fraction of investment and is not considered generally a good investment because of the way the rest of the regulation happens versus Bitcoin. None of that exists at all. So you're much more prone to pump and dump problems.
I think you are in the short run. I think that it remains to be seen what's going to happen when the last Bitcoin is actually mined, because there is a finite stock of Bitcoins. And so then what happens when there is a finite amount of Bitcoin in the world and there isn't going to be any more? I don't think that we exactly know what's going to happen then. I don't think that
why it has to work that way. Let me okay, so my experience with Bitcoin, it's kind of idealistic, but it originated through the use of the Brave browser. I don't know if you've heard of Brave, right? So it's a Chromium based browser, but it's not so much the browser per se, it's the ecosystem that the company has created around it. And so I invested just to see, right? What I liked about it was it was a way to get around but it really doesn't. It was a way to get around the manipulative collection of personal information to optimize the ads that I see. So it's kind of a combination of an ad blocker versus these ads that you don't have to, but these ads that you're willing to see that give you value. And you can spend this value to compensate the people, the content creators who are no longer benefiting from their opportunity to use Google ads or whatever. And so it ends up being kind of a micro payment system. So I like the idea, idealistically as a content creator, that somebody can actually compensate me from using or watching my content. And I objected to the notion that people were promoting ad blockers. That the internet is obviously all these interesting things, but the idea that people start to expect, there's so many problems in these areas. The idea that people could block ads and then expect free services and infrastructure and content creators just seemed to me to be a general ethical failing of the population, right?
Yeah.
And so this seemed to me to be a way around it, that there's a way to transfer money from me to someone who I follow.
But you're conflating two separate things there.
Of course I am. Yeah.
You're looking
but that's the problem. I mean, I don't know how else to do it.
That same system could also work.
It's a micropayment system, right?
It's just a micropayment system. Actually, it's three things. It's the browser that enables it as a platform, a micropayment system in addition, and then Bitcoin is the thing that's functioning the micropayment. So
I don't know.
I haven't turned on. I use Brave, but I haven't turned on the rewards yet. I've still got that popping up on my screen every day. But I haven't looked into it.
So let me finish my one little part of the story. I put in $50, right, just to see. Okay, I'm going to experiment. I'm going to, give away five whatever BAT a month. I forget how much it was, $2.50 or something. I'm just going to see how long my $50 lasts. Well, so I'm also going to join. So anybody who looks at my content, there's money coming back. Well, there's not much coming back. So mostly it's going out. But what happens is that my $50 balloons up to $250 because of this bizarre inflation deal. That to me was interesting. It's the kind of, I didn't want that. I didn't expect that, but it happened. It's down now to about 60. So it's gone, but I've done this for over a year. I'm still ahead somehow magically.
Wow.
Just in the value of BAT. So I could cash in for $60 and actually make $10 in the difference. But
Crazy. That's interesting.
Obviously, it's small time, but it's just, to me, so when the author here starts talking about alternative financing and being able to do as individuals, it gives us some leverage apart from the big players.
Mm-hmm.
I like those kind of ideas, and it's just an example. And that's why I wondered about your reaction to the cryptocurrency thing. Why it has to use a cryptocurrency. I forget bad is part of what it translates into Ethereum or some other Coinbase, or I don't know, some other some other kind of.
Well, I think it's interesting that that the whole thing. And I'd like to kind of jump from that to the next section, to the who owns your labor thing, because I think that's actually part of the answer, right? And I think the most interesting thing that she says right in that first paragraph of that, at the bottom of 158, even in Germany, where trade unions have a far greater influence over industrial policy, the share of wages in national output fell from 61% of GDP in 2001 to just 55% in 2007. And so the share of wages, and that's still actually very high relative to kind of us and other people. But so she concludes that across all high income countries, while workers' productivity grew over 5% from 2009 to 2013, their wages rose just 0.4%. So what that seems to suggest to me is that technology is the leverage point, right? And that technology is collecting, or is creating a bigger share, an increasing share of the value add, and so is and is also collecting a bigger share of the payment for the value add. Now, those two things may not be equivalent, right? And it may not be just that, I think probably generally technology is producing more value. I'm not going to argue that it's getting a just return for it. But I think that's one of the things that that's kind of one of my objections to, to sort of neo-Marxist and the whole labor theory of value, right? Is that, that ideas get generally instantiated in capital, technological capital, right? And then it's the owners of that technological capital that reap the benefit, whether it's labor saving capital or whether it's just more value producing capital, right? And that's where I think that she could have done more with this conversation that she has later about Alaska, at 164.
She mentions technology is one of her 5 opportunities, though, right?
Yeah, but on 164 she talks about the robots, right? Human niche work for some and guaranteed income for all would make a smart start to handling the rise of robots. And I think that kind of goes back to, Mark, what you were saying about, what is it, where is the value? I think the value is in human attention and human, kind of relationship, more so than in information, right? And that's my theory about education as well. But, then she goes on to talk about the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is not a great example, I think, because the Alaska Permanent Fund is based on it's based on oil under the ground.
Right. There has to be money from somewhere.
Right. Yeah. So this oil is this natural resource, right? So that's not really the equivalent of, the robot dividend is not the same as that, because somebody is going to own the robots, right? And it's going to be the owner of the robots, right? We're not going to be able to say that, well, that robots are a natural resource and everybody has an equal right to them, the way that everybody has an equal right to the oil or the minerals that are under the ground that that we all live on. So so there's a missing link there. I do like when she talks about who owns ideas, or she talks about kind of open source, software and open source hardware. And obviously I'm, all over the whole open educational resource thing and stuff. So I do think that is, that's.
She starts with the idea that for any of this to change, there has to be a commitment to diversity and and then she applied, I think, right, to you have to diversify, right? But then she talks about the 5 opportunities. But if you look at technology within, because that's one of the 5 things she recognizes, if anything, technology is a huge component moving in the opposite direction. I've been reading all this stuff lately. I put something in the Obsidian thing about reading. It's called The Big Nine, I think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's a book from some years ago, and it's talking about, this is before open AI,
right?
And it talks about these big companies and the problems because they're these big companies, but they have to be these big companies because they're the only they're the only organizations, at least anymore, that can do anything with AI. And in the U.S., the argument of the book is that they're competing with each other, and so to compete, it's kind of like a land grab. They're promoting stuff before they understand it and fully develop it, and in order to kind of, that's, she has this notion of why it's kind of out of control. And then the other number within the big name are Chinese companies, and of course they're using it under government control, which, I mean, the government is the only organization I can think of that could actually control this. And her example then, though, of when that happens is in China, and so that's kind of abusive, obviously, as it's being used. But so the whole idea, because I think most people in this group are technology interested and oriented. The idea of how it's going to diversify is unclear because it's obviously moving in the opposite direction very quickly and very powerfully.
Yeah, I think
historically it's always contracted.
What's that, Tim?
So historically, particularly on the software side, even though we are at one point we're all using Obsidian, was 2 people. He's now 5, if I remember rightly. But if you go back to somewhere earlier in the conversation, we were talking about Filofax and Covey's documents and stuff. I used Wins Organizer because it was visually like a Filofax screen. Okay? And you could automate a little bit, but not much. But that then got bought by what was then Lotus. And Lotus then got bought by IBM. They trashed it and came out with Lotus Notes, which nobody really uses anymore because they all went off and Microsoft wiped the floor with them with what comes out in Windows instead of OS 2. So that big company versus the little startup, and you then say, follow what Derek Shivers tries to get people to do, as in own your own data. So a bit like Chris and his indie web. Own your own data. Take your stuff out of the iCloud and put it in your own baby cloud somewhere that is on somebody else's server, and you buy a server space at somebody who's providing a service. Is just like, oh, I can't garage my car, but somebody down the road's got a garage. I'll put it there because he's a small guy, he's got 5 garages, as opposed to Chris with his 55 garages across California. But they're all susceptible to the same earthquake problem. So there isn't the diversity of support, etc. Same way as I was saying earlier, when we were doing the data centers, we were supposed not to have that were all in the same country, which is one of the reasons why we picked Europe to put them in. And, you know, we had 2 in Germany, 2 in France, 1 in Switzerland, 1 in Norway, 2 in the UK. We will have 3 in Spain, etc. But I'm also never next door to each other. So it's Munich and Frankfurt and Berlin, you know, Paris and Marseille, London and Leeds, you know, about as far away as you get within the country. If you're willing to do the work, as most of us in this room, as it were, are probably willing to do the work to tinker around with obsidian, which, if you compare it to, say, Evernote practically worked out the box. You had to have a system to get the best out of it, but that was you and a process. It didn't actually really change the software. And now, of course, Evernote struggle. It's got to 250 million plus subscribers and can't cope. So it now been bought out. If it had been bought out by Microsoft, it would disappear, or bought out by Google, it would disappear. Because every time Google buys something, it sticks around for a few months or a couple of years. It disappears. It either gets totally incorporated into something else, or it actually disappears. I mean, who uses Google Plus anymore? Nobody, not even Chris. So the particularly the American model of things getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and that you end up with the complexities of, say, the car buying side. I mean, you've got like 5 or 6 major car manufacturers, and they all have the same day-to-day, pretty much, day-to-day economic problems, because they've all pretty much come from the same historical background. That's where the money has gone. You've got so much invested in making internal combustion engines that 30 years ago, it was saying we can't contemplate going to an electric motor. So it had to be a new car manufacturer that flips over and does something else, as in Tesla, to make the market move. You know, DR-DOS, back in the day before Microsoft DOS was prevalent, was doing really well. It came out for free, practically. It was my original DOS for home. And it got to DR-DOS for 5, and there was no DR-DOS 6. Because we'd all moved to Windows. Or we got a Mac.
I remember receiving a cease and desist letter from Bill Gates in like 1989 or so, when we were using maybe 88. We were using DR-DOS. We were packaging, we were bundling it with our clones that we were making in north of Minneapolis, and we got a letter from Gates's legal department saying, you know, they're coming after us. But if we would start bundling MS-DOS, they would give us GW Basic for free. So that's the basis in my mind. That's the basis of Bill Gates's empire, because that was well before Windows, even on 286 was a kind of a legitimate and useful product.
You needed a 386 to run Windows at any really, from memory.
What's that?
You needed a 386 from memory to be able to run some form of Windows.
Well, Windows 386 was a big step up. I mean, there was a product before, but actually it wasn't really. I mean, it was sort of on par with Compact Desk View, actually, at that point, which was I
mean, DR-DOS 5 came with, I can't remember what it's called now, but there was a pointer mouse icon window, like one of the games computers had a visual front end. Oh, Gem. Yeah, it came with Gem.
Yep.
And that was pretty much did exactly the same. It didn't look quite so refined. but it did the same as the Windows 3, 3.1 and 3.11. And I managed to blag my way into the European release of 3.11, the Windows for Workgroups, as it was also called. And Steve Ballmer was doing the Ballmer, the number 2?
Ballmer,
back then. Was doing the presentation, and of course, it crashed.
Yeah.
About click number 4, and then it had to be restarted, and it did okay after that. But it's like first time you ever try these things, it's always going to crash. And it's sort of thereafter, it was if it didn't crash, there was something wrong. And practically everything I knew about how it worked under the hood doesn't apply anymore. Yet they still call it Windows, although it's Windows 11. You know, I can't use the regedit in the same way, and I can't put groups inside groups without another bit of software that is a retro build to make Windows do what it used to do. I can't build my own icons in quite the same way.
I haven't really followed Windows since '95. But I do think that these technology, kind of getting back to the book because we're running out of time. These technology things that she identifies, I think, are real, right? These questions of where is value added and how is value compensated kind of covers those two questions, right? Labor and what's labor and what's money. And in the we were talking earlier in the Chris, you mentioned in the chat, labor and time are not exactly the same thing, but attention time is also something that can be measured and can be valued.
Yeah.
And I think as we as we move, I think what AI is going to focus us on is things that are uniquely human, right? And human attention is one of those things.
Yeah, and attention has been so heavily commodified now, or there are ways to do it. I think one of the screwy things too that I feel is heavily missing from the book thus far too is, and she talks about information in fits and spurts here and there, but we as a people in a society and in an economy, we value information, but we don't have a means of putting specific value on it other than extracting it from or using it, leveraging information to extract value from other things. Mm-hmm. But I don't have, I can write down a sentence and it can have some information in it, but we have no way to value what that information is. And some information is obviously more valuable than others. Mm-hmm. Even to the point that, if I can build my data center closer to Wall Street so that I can front run data to make my trades faster than you
by
and
a
then
millisecond.
I see your trade before it hits and I can buy it quicker than you can, and then you end up buying it from me for fractions of a cent larger.
Yeah.
That information obviously has massive value, or we wouldn't be doing that, but we just don't have a means of. And some things are more valuable than others as bits of information. So it's, but we don't have, that doesn't enter into the system because we really have no way of measuring it and valuing it. Mm-hmm. And it's a massive swath of the economy that's just missing from our ability to do any science on.
And the quality and the accuracy of the information, I think, is going to be increasingly problematic going forward, right? I was looking, I love Wikipedia, right? But I was looking up, as I mentioned earlier in the chat, I was listening to the audiobook of Kennedy's takedown of Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci this week. And so and I remember, sort of Carrie Mullis and Peter Duesberg challenging the HIV hypothesis, back from the day. But I thought, okay, I'll remind myself of that, And so I checked it. I looked Duesberg up on Wikipedia, and it is, and again, and this is of course at the margin, right? This is not, kind of mainstream information, but it is wildly from a perspective, right? And the language that it uses, and I'm sure it's been battled over. I didn't, drill down to see, how much fighting there's going on behind the scenes on that. And I have been involved in fights over wiki pages and editing them in the past. So I'm familiar with how that can work, but this, and that, and in thinking about Wikipedia, that's one of the things that they advertise as a value add, as a strength, right? Is this ability of millions or billions of people to, to contribute and edit. But it has its problematic side as well.
Yeah, even 2 years back, and it's been cleaned up, and I haven't touched it as much lately. But even the page for Zettelkasten, it's kind of like everybody is contributing to this page as if it's a new thing that we've never seen before until right. Nicholas Luhmann shows up. And then it's kind of like, and somebody says, well, you can't call a commonplace book kept on index cards as Zettelkasten. It's not the same thing. Mm-hmm. So you have to like dig in and go and prove that, yes, these two traditions are, have been the same all along. It's just idiots now who are co-opting the word from German into English think nothing else has ever existed before. And it's, and then you got to find sources for how to do that. It's, it was a huge thing the day that somebody took, the word card index and had that point back to Zettelkasten as a thing. And it's like, hey, so we're going to wrap up the book next week.
Yeah, and I think so. Shall we? Yeah, I think we can.
Have we picked the book after?
Yeah. I think that gives us some time this week to kind of pick the book after. The one that seems to have the most support behind it is that Simon Winchester one, which I would be happy with.
Oh, good. I already have a copy, so.
So we got Matthew, Nate, Steve Wright, Lewis, and I have voted on that. Mark and Tim have not. How do you feel about that one? Knowing what we know, the transmission of knowledge from ancient wisdom to modern magic. One of Chris's favorite nonfiction authors.
I won't poo-poo it. There's so many good things on that list anyway, too. It's you can throw a dart and.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. The one thing about that list that I have noticed is that it's getting to be so long that I kind of felt like I thought I would put that book that I've been reading in there this week, and then I thought, the Hunter-Gatherer's Guide one, and I thought, oh crap, nobody will even ever see it at the bottom of the list.
The better way to do it is to put it at the top of the community forum as I nominate this, and then put it in the list.
Good point.
And that will put more eyeballs on it.
Yep.
And then every once a month I'll look at that list and then or at least as we finish a book, I'll do a sort order of how many votes has something got.
Right. Right. All right. Okay. So I will be I'll be in Iceland next week, and then I'll be back 2 weeks from today. So we'll finish up with this book then.
Just general vacation, or are you doing some history?
No, just general family vacation. Yeah, we're only going for 4 days, so it'll be quick. But we're gonna sit in a lot of thermal pools, I guess.
Yeah. We'll expect to see the dewy glow of your skin when you come back.
Yeah, hopefully. Although it's probably going to be more like March weather there. It's going to be in the 40s and 50s most days, and probably raining. So,
Yeah.
I'll take some pictures.
Sounds good.
All right.
Have fun, Dan.
Take care.
Take care.